Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas. In our brand new study in apologetics, we're looking at the book Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace, published in 2013 by Cook Publishing in Colorado. We're going to take a look at chapters 1 and 2 to get started here. We're going to look at the role of presuppositions, the role of inference, and then the categories of distortion or accuracy. Let's begin with block 1. Let's take a look at the presuppositions. And we're told by Wallace that the first principle for our apologetics is objectivity. We all hold presuppositions that impact the way we see the world. You need to be open to all reasonable possibilities. You should not begin with a preconceived philosophy that dictates the outcome. Therefore, the first principle is objectivity. The secular presupposition is usually philosophical materialism. So under philosophical materialism, this negates the existence of supernatural agency. It posits natural laws that account for every phenomena. It examines the relationship between material objects and natural forces. Science is skewed to ignore any supernatural explanation. So let's look at this skewed ignorance in Note 3. Historical scholars accept the historicity of the New Testament, but reject the historicity of any miracles. They have a presupposition that no historical evidence can demonstrate a miracle. That's their preconceived worldview. We all hold a worldview. This prior worldview must not prevent us from being objective. So, note 4 under worldview and objectivity. We must lay down our presuppositions. We need to be open to following the evidence, period. He uses the metaphor of a carry-out bag, a call-out bag, and it contained the gear that he needed to investigate a crime scene. It included an investigation checklist. So if we look at this metaphor of an investigative checklist in Note 5, we need to differentiate between scientism and true science. True science is the systematic examination of phenomena. And Wallace tells us God's activity is not overly miraculous. He is at work in the interactions between matter as well. God created the natural law that reflects his nature. So in block 1 we learned that the first principle of Wallace's position is going to be the principle of objectivity, and that means to lay aside your presuppositions as you examine evidence. Now let's go to block 2 and take a look at the methodology of inference. We begin in block 2, note 1, to infer, and its 5 aspects. It's called abductive reasoning, inferring to the most reasonable explanation. Principle 2 equals refrain from speculation. Concentrate on what is reasonable in light of the evidence. When considering competing explanations, there are the following 5 aspects that apply. The truth must be feasible. The truth must be straightforward in explanatory simplicity. The truth should be exhaustive, accounting for all the evidence. The truth must be logical with explanatory consistency, and the truth will be superior, unique in a superior way to other alternatives. Now let's apply inference to the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. And Wallace tells us that there are 4 minimal facts of evidence to be considered. 1. Jesus died on the cross and was buried. 2. Jesus' tomb was empty and no body was ever produced. 3. Jesus' disciples believed they saw Jesus resurrected from the dead. 4. Jesus' disciples were transformed following their resurrection observations. Now there are possible explanations for these minimal facts. Number 1, the disciples were wrong about Jesus' death. This view fails to address what the disciples experienced when they pulled Jesus from the cross. Those preparing the body for burial would have known if he was still alive. Unfriendly Roman sources also testified to Jesus' death. So that can be discounted. Now, number 2, the disciples lied about the resurrection. This fails to account for the transformed lives of the apostles. Also, conspiracies that involve a large number of people over an extended period of time is a very unlikely occurrence. Plus, Jewish authorities had the tomb guarded. 3. The disciples were imaginative, only imagining to see Jesus alive. This fails to explain the empty tomb. Exaggerations usually involve the character of the deceased. Large groups do not have the same type of imaginative delusion. Number 4, the disciples were fooled by an impostor. It requires an additional set of conspirators. Also, it does not account for the fact that some disciples were skeptical themselves, like Thomas. Then 5, the disciples were influenced by limited spiritual sightings, where 1 or 2 disciples had visions and talked the others into believing it. This view presents resurrection observations that are inconsistent with the biblical record. It is unlikely that a large group could be influenced in this way. That brings us to the block 3 and the conclusion to this first lesson, whether we should consider the evidence in the Gospels as a distortion or as accuracy, by first laying down our presuppositions and taking up the methodology of inference or abductive reasoning. So block 3, we'll take a look at distortion. Has there simply been a growing legend over time concerning Jesus? Problems. This fails to account for the early claims of the apostles. The original record must take priority. Early accounts cite the resurrection of Jesus. Even students of the disciples also cited the resurrection as central testimony. The earliest oral creed is recorded in 1 Corinthians 15 and makes the resurrection a key testimony. Now, 2, accuracy. Are the Gospels accurate accounts and accurate testimony concerning the event concerning Jesus? Problem here, the position requires a belief in the supernatural. Therefore, Wallace says, let's take a look at abductive reasoning and resurrection. That the Gospels are accurate is our most reasonable option. It has the least number of liabilities. We must simply put aside any bias against anything supernatural. Lay down that presupposition. We must simply allow for God in the first place. Jesus was resurrected as reported in the Gospels is our most reasonable conclusion. Now, before he wants to proceed any further in the book, he wants to redefine terms, and by that he means he wants to redefine faith. Faith is the opposite of unbelief. It's not the opposite of reason. In other words, faith is not blind faith. Faith equals, here's his definition, a reasonable inference based on evidence. Remember that. That is his definition throughout the remainder of the book. Faith is a reasonable inference based on evidence. We must embrace evidential faith. He's positing the notion of evidential faith. He says Acts 1, 2, and 3 supports this redefinition. Jesus understood the value of evidence by remaining with the disciples for 40 days and confirming his resurrection over that period of 40 days. So we learn from these first 2 chapters basically the methodology that J. Warner Wallace wants to take up in his apologetics. Number one, we must bracket, or we must lay down and put aside our presuppositions. We must lay down our philosophical materialism, bracket our philosophical materialism that says that the supernatural is an impossibility. We must lay down, bracket, put aside our presuppositions. Then, on the affirmation side, we affirm the methodology of abductive reasoning. We infer the most reasonable explanation of the evidence. We infer the most reasonable explanation of the evidence. If we do those two things, then we are taking up what he calls evidential faith. It's reasonable inference based on evidence. Reasonable inference based on evidence. And if we do that, we will reach an accurate explanation of the evidence in the Gospels. And that's going to be his approach for the remainder of the book. It's about a 300-page book. This takes us from page 25 to 55, chapters 1 and 2. Our next lesson is going to take up chapters 3 and 4. But it gives us a solid beginning because it gives us a beginning as methodology. And that's the perfect place to begin. Begin with methodology. Okay, what's going to be the methodology for his apologetics? Now we know. Negate presuppositions. Affirm inference. If we negate presuppositions and affirm inference, they will be synthesized into a redefinition of faith as evidential faith. And that becomes your recall triad. Negate presuppositions, affirm inference or abductive reasoning. Those two will synthesize as the necessity of evidential faith. Faith as a reasonable inference based on evidence. A reasonable inference based on evidence. Evidential faith. So it gives us a methodology beginning. Our first lesson is methodology, and it should be. That really should be the beginning for any apologetic. What's going to be the methodology? And what is the redefined terms? And the key term is faith. He gives us a definition. So that's going to wrap up chapters 1 and 2, our first lesson. Our next lesson is going to pick up chapters 3 and 4.